Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hello, and welcome back to Red Light Exposé. I'm your host, Victoria Gugenheim, and I'm joined here by my fantastic co-host, Elly Arrow. And we have some fantastic guests for you tonight. The first one is Stacia West, who is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee's College of Social Work and the co-founder and director of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. West holds a BA in Women's Studies and Philosophy and a Master's of Science in Social Work from the University of Tennessee and is an expert on UBI. Also with us is Karl Widerquist, who is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, Qatar, with a background as an economist. He then also specializes in distributive justice, the ethics of who has what. He also writes on many topics, including social contract theory, freedom, equality, property rights, and sufficientarianism, and is best known for his work on basic income. We're very excited to have you here tonight. Welcome both.
Good to be here.
Thank you for having us.
This particular episode is something our guests have requested. They want to know, what can we do to fight poverty? And UBI, Universal Basic Income, is one of those things that comes up repeatedly. It's also one of those things very quickly derided. A lot of people look down on it. I've really learned about it during the Andrew Yang candidacy that I'm sure you both followed with some interest, even though it was ultimately unsuccessful. I just remember a lot of confusion. What is UBI? A lot of people making fun of it. Fear around the risks if it's poorly implemented. So when you have limited time to convince people, what is your elevator pitch to get them on board?
Thank you, Elly. It's hard to make it succinct. That's not what we're good at as academics. However, I will say we are at an inflection point in human history where the crises of capitalism is violent and deadly. And something has to change radically in order for us to continue on our path of human flourishing. I'll use the term guaranteed income most frequently rather than universal basic income. Guaranteed income is a way of thinking about wealth redistribution that may apply to all individuals that are part of a place. So regardless of citizenship status, may be enough to cover basic needs. And most importantly is a recurring benefit, typically occurring on a monthly basis. Importantly, it is to be paired alongside existing government social safety net benefits in the U.S. that will look like SNAP, or what was formerly known as food stamps, HUD, or Section 8 vouchers, so that we have a suite of social programs that sort of create a floor that we as humans agree we should not let our fellow humans fall beneath. There's a standard of living that we all deserve just by the dignity of being human, and that is how I conceptualize and how I would pitch a guaranteed income.
I think we need a basic income because it's wrong to come between anybody and the resources that they need to survive. We have to get real with ourselves that is exactly what our society does. All the resources that we could use to build our own shelter, grow our own food, hunt, gather, fish, farm, start our own business, start our own cooperative, all of those things are owned by somebody else. And most of those people are very wealthy people. And most of us, most of the time, through most of our lives, have to go to either the government or to very wealthy people and say, please, sir, what can I do for you to get access to the resources that I need to survive? We hold that power over individuals, and it's simply wrong to do that. We want to privatize resources. We got to do it in a way that makes sure that everybody gets access to enough resources to survive. And universal basic income, and also its cousin, guaranteed income, is an effective way to do that.
So we did have in our questions, why the universal bit? Because people often say, why not just give it to people currently below the poverty line? Or in Sweden, sometimes they pay students to study. You have a guaranteed income, but only for the time of your bachelor's or your master's or whatever. And then we hope you can take care of yourself and you're off the program. What's the argument for or against the U in UBI?
Well, we're on opposite sides of this one. So I guess I'll give the four. Universal basic income, as usually conceived, is an income for everyone, whether they're rich or poor. Whereas usually a guaranteed income comes in the form of a negative income tax where you only get the full amount if you're at zero income and they take a little bit off of your income, your basic amount, as your income rises. This is close you can get to UBI with a means tested benefit. And mathematically, you can show that you can get the same outcomes if you can gather all the same data at the right time and everything. You can get the same outcomes with both. After the fact, a couple of reasons why I think the universal model is better. One reason is that benefits exclusively for the poor end up exclusively being poor benefits. Once you're saying this is only for those other people, those poor people, it's very easy for a demagogue to go to you and say, these other people are bad. Look what they do. They're different from you. You're not going to ever become one of them. And I can lower your taxes by taking this away from these people. And if you already think those people are bad and doing bad things, you can say, well, they'll lose this benefit and maybe I'll get a tax cut, maybe I won't. But if it's a universal benefit like Social Security, everybody gets it, even people who are net contributors. You can tell them, well, I'm going to take away your Social Security and I'm going to lower your taxes even more. They'll say, well, is that really going to happen? Because I know if I agree to this, then I'm going to lose all my Social Security. Am I really going to get a tax cut big enough to make up for this? So you're harnessing the self-interest of the upper middle class to get them behind it. And we find this is also true in universal programs like the Alaska dividend. The other reason is that everything about the means tested version that makes it easier for middle and upper income people and maybe for taxing authorities, and makes it more difficult for the people who need it most. The people who need basic income most are people who are in an acute crisis right now. And if you've got that basic income always coming to you in your name, you can count on it. If the government has to figure out how much you owe this week in order to find out if you get a basic income this week, and they fall behind and they think you've got a high income when you've actually got a low income, then you are out of luck. Suppose you're a spouse married to a very wealthy man, and you as a spouse married to this wealthy man have 3 kids. You find out that your husband is abusing your children. So you take your children and you flee. If you got a basic income, you've got money constantly going into your account in your name. If you've got a guaranteed income, you get to the shelter and then you don't have any money because you're part of this family that has a very high income. And then you got to call some taxing authority and you've got to say, look, I left my husband. Can you please activate the negative income tax? And they say, oh, it says here you live at this address. Can you prove that you live at this shelter? That's a hardship that people going under an acute crisis don't need to go through. And basic income is a way to make it much easier for them. The typical argument against is supposedly giving it only to poor people makes it cheaper, but it doesn't, because the rich people, if you give them $10,000, you just tax them by $10,000 more to take back the money you gave them. It doesn't cost any more to give it to people at higher income.
Yeah, Karl, I do not disagree with you on universality. I think it is the best approach. That is philosophically what I am in agreement with. Practically speaking, there was an opportunity in the US to experiment with a guaranteed income in a way that we had not seen since 1965 through 1980. For a number of reasons, cultural zeitgeist with Andrew Yang, with the COVID-19 pandemic, with this influx of federal dollars, we have a plurality of municipalities that are saying, how do we support folks that are out of work, that are sick, that are facing down this public and economic crisis that is COVID-19? So that is what really sparked guaranteed income bubbling up in the US in 2019, 2020. What I will disagree with Karl on is that guaranteed income or a basic income that is not universal does not necessarily have to be means tested. And the first experiment that I ran was not means tested. So it was simply a matter of geography. But you could think about it as a number of different scenarios, including the one that Karl mentioned. Say a survivor goes to a shelter or to an IPV service provider. Because of that life circumstance, that may trigger a guaranteed income or a basic income. I agree here too that there is some administrative burden that goes into that. And by the way that the government works, right, they're going to want to demonstrate some sort of proof or due diligence that the survivor is for real, which I think is ridiculous. But that is to say, we can have a guaranteed income or a basic income without a means test, though it may be a circumstantial or a life stage that triggers it.
I should say, just for the benefit of your listeners here, the language is kind of in flux at the moment. Not everybody's using the terms in the same way. Universal basic income almost always means an income given to everybody, rich or poor. Guaranteed income can mean one that is only given to poor people, or it can be a branch term for one whether or not it is given to poor people, just anything that ensures that everybody's going to have some minimum income regardless of whether they work or not. When you use guaranteed income, which of those two ways do you usually mean?
All I mean is that it is not universal and may or may not be means tested. We're going to Brazil next week to fight this out face to face.
What other ways do you mean other than means tested?
So, for example, in California, there's a state-funded pilot that whenever you age out of foster care, for example, that you receive a guaranteed income. And many pilots that we see happening now, regardless of income level, if you're a pregnant woman in a specific area, then you receive a guaranteed income. So I'm saying there are life stage triggers or crisis triggers.
Oh, yeah, but those are like targeted experiments looking at how universal basic income would affect people leaving foster care, people getting out of incarceration, or people going through this particular life crisis.
And I'm looking at it as policy pathways, right? So where is the policy pathway? I want it to be a universal pathway in my heart and soul. For the here and now, I don't think that that is feasible. So what are the policy pathways that might be launch points for us to be able to scale this?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, we have the same issue with policies around sexual exploitation. What we want is a whole package of things to happen for survivors, and we have to push for them bit by bit and get society used to the fact that this is a deserving group of people. The stigma against persons in the pornography industry or the prostitution industry is horrendous, and just to convince the public that these are not people we should leave behind, who deserve resources, who have a right to exit when they want to, when they're ready to.
Stacia, I think there was a talk I saw on the concept of deservedness and how it's a psychologically beneficial thing to receive a universal basic income, because people who think that they are not deserving of help or not deserving of money or not deserving of any assistance then start getting it and actually changes their self-worth. And I was wondering if you had anything to say on that kind of concept of deservedness and if that's come up in further experiments for you.
Sure. The consistent narrative is that we as humans are only valuable insofar as we are productive laborers and that is monetized, commodified, and sold. This gets into what do we mean by labor that matters? In my estimation, guaranteed income, universal basic income is an agentic instrument that imbues a person with agency to make their own decisions. And that coming from a government or power above you with no strings attached really frees your humanity, frees your dignity to not be tied to your body's ability to labor for the market. And so when we have that shift, we start thinking about deservedness in a different way. We start thinking about care work as work that ought to be paid. But in the absence of payment for that, at least understanding the ways that it does contribute to the economy, it also asks us to think about the deservedness of leisure, that each of us as humans deserves rest and deserves leisure. And there are many times in our lives that we should have the freedom to enjoy that and not worry about the commodification of our bodies.
Yes. I think that's such an apt argument because especially for women who have exited prostitution or they've suffered any serious sexual violence, the constant narrative is that's all you're good for. And if they actually have a tangible monetary thing of going, actually, no, that's not all you're good for. You are a full human being and you deserve to have a life like everybody else. That's monumental.
Stacia's argument there is really important, but I think there's something other. She's talking about it from you're deserving because you're a human being. I emphasize You're deserving of this because so many things you've already done without you contributing labor to the economy. If you're going to be a net beneficiary of basic income, people have made all kinds of rules that are favorable to the upper classes and less favorable to you, saying somebody else owns the property. And we'd like to pretend that this is just some natural process that got us to the point where a few people own most of the property and the rest of us really don't own much of anything. We like to think we own something, but really the bank does and we're paying them off. That's not a natural process. That follows from laws that governments have made, and privileged people have controlled those governments. You've already contributed by the fact that I have to use fewer resources than everyone else. I should get some services for everyone else for the fact that they have taken most of the resources, but also that they've made all kinds of rules that favor one group or another, rules of how the market works. Nobody consulted the people who are homeless to say, should those people get more resources? We make rules of who can live where and what sort of rules apply there. Another fairy story we tell ourselves is that, oh, everybody agrees to be ruled by the majority, so whatever the majority says is the decision of everybody. That's not true. The majority speaks for itself. It's a faction of 51%, and it rarely includes the people at the very bottom, and it never includes everybody who's disadvantaged. So you're disadvantaged by a whole set of rules that are made favorable to another group. You deserve it because of what has been imposed on you at the get-go.
It kind of ties into the wealth transfer argument that's been going around at the moment, especially in the UK. If you know a guy called Gary's Economics, he talks about the COVID event made a mass wealth transfer from the poor to the rich, because the rich are luxury spenders and they will spend on the things they want, and the poor are people who spend on the things they need. And when they were furloughed, they were given 75% of their wages to spend on rent or mortgage or food or bills. And the rich people own all the places where you can get your food, or you've had a mortgage given to you. And so this actually paved the way for accelerated inequality. One counter argument people are saying is that the UBI payment will result in a wealth transfer to the rich, but I just don't think that at all, because you can work alongside UBI, and it's kind of akin in some structures to the NHS. The idea of there is a service there for you, whether you're rich or poor. I feel like it's kind of a toxic counter argument to have that, oh, if you give poor people more money, they're going to end up at a disadvantage. I just think it's nonsensical. So I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
I was going to tie my question directly to what you just said, Victoria, as in, how is the UBI paid for? Is it a tax on anyone? Is it a tax on certain people? I know that Andrew Yang proposed taxing the tech sector, which is famous for offshoring and evading and not contributing. So how can we make sure the wealth is going in the direction of the people who deserve it most, who need it most?
Sure. I mean, a system of progressive taxation is going to take care of this, right? In the case of sort of furloughs, I'm not familiar with the study that you mentioned, so I won't comment on that. I will bring up the negative income tax argument, which would be we're unwilling to accept anyone falling below the supplemental poverty measure every year. So every year when you file your taxes, if you come below that, then the negative income tax is going to kick in and bring you up to the supplemental poverty measure. Or there are arguments, Friedman had argued 50% of the federal poverty line, but no matter what the case, you have those that are wealthier that are essentially subsidizing that wage, necessarily because they are the ones that are exploiting the lower income workers, right? So this system of progressive taxation would work similarly, though I do absolutely agree that data taxes are something that could be leveraged and should be leveraged alongside a way to fund this.
It's funny to me that people have a hard time understanding this with basic income, but they don't have a hard time understanding this with Social Security. It goes to everybody. Very rich billionaires are getting Social Security checks every month. You cannot turn them down. You can give it a charity or something, but you can't turn it down. And that's in there for a good reason. Billionaires are not net beneficiaries of Social Security. They pay way more in taxes than you have in basic income. And if you're going to introduce a basic income that's not going to be inflationary, you're going to have to do something to counteract any inflationary pressure that a basic income introduces. And you do that by progressive taxation. It could be a graduated income tax. It could be a wealth tax. It could be a land value and natural resource tax. It could be taxes on pollution. It could be user fees on the banks that profit so much from the Federal Reserve, assuming the risk for them. There are so many things that the wealthy benefit from the government, and that's just taxes. Also, we could end government giveaways for the rich, which are enormous. What happens most in our economy is the lobbyists go and they have something they want to sell to the government. They spread some money around Congress, and Congress buys it for them, including things the Defense Department doesn't need or people don't want anymore, like pennies or dollar bills rather than dollar coins. We make those things because the lobbyists for the companies that sell those to the government spread money around Congress. You get rid of those things and you put that together with progressive taxation. No, the billionaires are not going to be coming out better than
That makes perfect sense. Because I think you've put forward this fantastic steelman argument here.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
But one of the counter arguments against universal basic income or guaranteed income is, oh, people will just be lazy, people will turn to alcohol and drugs and tobacco, or they just spend it on stupid things. And like, it's just not true. All of the trials haven't worked out that way. So can I put that question to Stacia? And then obviously, Karl, you can jump in afterwards.
Sure. I was a practicing social worker for many years and I met partner violence and homelessness. I've myself experienced poverty. And there is no person in this world that is a more rational economic actor than a person experiencing poverty and scarcity. They prioritize the basic needs. And if anything is left over, typically very little, then maybe there's some spending on luxury goods or something like that. But the real problem that I have with this argument is that there's a disproportionate share of spending on bullshit from rich people, not from the poor. The cost of your wine subscription, your cocaine, your jet fuel. Why are those individuals not dragged through the coals for the things that they do publicly that are absolutely reckless and really contribute nothing? And I will say in many cases, that money is not earned. That money is provided through dividends from parents and other investments.
I question the idea that we should be judging how poor people spend their money. Other people took all the resources and owe them something. People aren't born owing their labor to rich people. Rich people are born owing something to everybody else because they took all the resources of the earth. When you compensate somebody, it's always in cash. If I break your leg, I got to pay you in cash because I can't put your leg back. Well, we've taken the resources of the earth. We need to give people back for that. And it's up to them how they spend their compensation. Just as it's up to you how you spend your salary. If you get a legal settlement, it is up to you how you spend that money. Basic income is not special spending. It's just another kind of government spending. And all government spending creates inflationary pressure, but all government taxation and borrowing of money creates deflationary pressure. And now there's complex creation of inflationary and deflationary pressure going on in the economic system as a whole. It's not just about what the government does, but it's a government's job to balance those pressures. If there's too much inflationary pressure, then you tax people to create some deflationary pressure and balance that out. And there's so much wasteful spending on the part of wealthier people that there's plenty of things we can target. Say private helicopter services that take people to their tennis lessons in other states. We could maybe tax that, free up some resources. Now, there was another issue you said about making people lazy. Are the poor lazy? Well, why are we even asking the question? If somebody makes a job offer and another person doesn't take it, we're always saying lazy worker if they don't take that job. Well, what about cheap employer? If I'm living off a basic income of $15,000 a year and somebody offers me a job that's really not that much better, the working conditions kind of suck, the boss is not nice to me, and they pay me for crap, and I don't need this job. Maybe the problem is not that I'm lazy, but this guy is cheap. So what we're doing when we focus on this lazy worker issue is that we are really looking at a disagreement between two people. What's a good wage for this job? And we are judging one side harshly and morally and leaving the other side free from harsh moral judgment. We don't do that with other commodities. Say, I'm selling bananas and I'm selling a banana for $4 and somebody doesn't want to buy my banana. Is that a cheap banana purchaser or am I a lazy banana seller? We don't usually put that kind of judgment on whether or not people buy things, but we do when it's are poor people going to sell their labor to rich people.
We have the same issue over here when we discuss sexual exploitation. Everyone's always talking. Is the woman doing it voluntarily? Yes or no? Is she harming herself? Is she harming the community? No one's talking about the buyer. No one's talking about the brothel owner. The men who own OnlyFans, the insane amount of money they make while knowingly profiting. We do now know there was a big report in Reuters of trafficking of people. The average woman on OnlyFans is just trying to supplement her basic needs. And we're talking all day long, are they bringing down society? Who made the website? Whose money, whose excess income is propping up the website? Those people, the same power dynamics, we don't talk about this. But I was going to move into the subject of the vulnerable groups. What do we actually see in the trials that have been run? What do we see the effect on low-income people, people in difficult family situations, formerly incarcerated? We've already touched on some of these. What does the data or even anecdotes tell us of what might happen if it's done well?
Sure. There's a good amount of literature that would suggest that giving people money makes them better writ large. This is to say, people have improvements in savings. They have reductions in financial instability and volatility. They have improvements in financial capability. Food security is better. They're better able to meet basic needs. No shit, right? When we move to things like mental and physical health, particularly with very large experiments with variable populations, we see rather mixed effects. That is to say, null or positive effects. In no case have we seen cash do harm to any individual in an experiment that has showed up in a paper or whatever. But those mental and physical health effects are a bit unknown right now. And I think as more studies roll out, we'll be able to understand them. However, it takes me a really long time to change my mental health. It takes an even longer time for me to change my physical health. And I am now a woman with quite a bit of privilege. So most of these experiments are only a year or 18 months long. In my estimation, that's a very short time to change your health trajectory that you have been accumulating right through all of your privilege or trauma or whatever it may be. So it may be the case that something like a universal basic income, which we haven't experimented with, could realize some psychological and physical health effects. Now, whenever you target it down to specific populations, individuals experiencing homelessness, returning citizens from incarceration, people that are experiencing intimate partner violence, there we have some more laser focused outcomes. So in Los Angeles, for example, we see a 12 percentage point reduction in the exposure and severity of intimate partner violence and women being able to choose healthier relationships or to exit a relationship that is not healthy. So that's a really promising finding. We see reductions in incarceration over the course of a year after release down in Gainesville, Florida, which is one of the most hostile states toward folks that are being released from incarceration. And then additionally, and this is not talked about enough, the open research study that was funded by Sam Altman and led by Elizabeth Rhodes actually did see reductions in alcohol consumption in young men that were in the study. You know, you look in the news right now and it's all about, oh, there was no effect or people worked an hour less. Right. But that actually is a pretty important health finding, right? Whenever people that we know have very high rates of substance use are able to tamp that down. That's kind of broadly where we are experimentally right now.
And that last thing is something that we should expect. You think, oh, there's these bad people out there who are addicts. You give them more money, they're going to be more addicts. That's not how it works. Addiction is a response to stress, anxiety, and fear. People seek a little joy in their life when things are terrible. If you're a former smoker and you lose your house, you are very much more likely to relapse into smoking cigarettes because you're going through this stressful situation. If we take out the biggest stress in people's lives, that I will someday be homeless because we have no basic income, you take that stress out, you are very likely to reduce addiction, which is something we should expect. It shouldn't be anything surprising. And I think the look at women getting out of bad marriages is a progress in how rhetoric has changed since we started doing experiments like this 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the rhetoric was that, well, the existing rules were causing women to leave their husbands in order to be eligible for aid to families with dependent children, the existing benefit that was targeted at single mothers at the time. And they thought having a guaranteed income was going to cause divorces to go down. But instead, divorces went up, at least in some studies. Others said it didn't. And the big fight was, did divorce go up or not? But the rhetoric assumed that divorce going up was bad, even though they only had one explanation for why divorces might have gone up, is that women were financially dependent on men, and the guaranteed income relieved the women from financial dependence on men. Well, if you got a woman who's only in a marriage because she's financially dependent on men, maybe there's something wrong with that marriage. Maybe it's really not a bad thing that marriage broke up. If you want to lower the divorce rate, just make it so all women are completely and utterly, totally financially dependent on men. You get a much lower divorce rate. That'd be a horrible thing to do. But there are other things that are more important, like, is the woman being abused?
Yeah, exactly. And you've just reminded me, when you were talking about addiction, we already know about how trauma causes addiction in rat models. Like, we knew this from the 70s when it was Bruce
Yeah,
Alexander.
yeah.
What is it? British Columbia in Canada, I think. And they were looking at morphine in animals when they were kept in metal cages. And if they're kept in cages and absolutely miserable with their lives, they use the morphine more. But if they then have the rat theme park where they have like loads of different stimulation because they're really social animals and they get to like communicate with other rats and so on, then magically they don't want to use it. It's like, how have we not applied this to humans yet? Like, it beggars belief to me, you know?
Yeah, the scientific literacy is really in the gutter, and I think that's an important point.
And a lot of people still haven't heard those rat studies. Those studies should be the famous as the ones where the rat that's all by themselves goes and does cocaine until they OD. And they're not. They're not as well known as that.
Yeah, you're totally right. Keeping it on theme a little bit, what about the effects of UBI on artists and other commonly self-employed groups who are vulnerable to poverty? I'm an artist as well, and it's a very, very precarious career to have, where it's either feast or famine sometimes. People can argue that necessity is the mother of invention, but actually if you can't eat or keep your light on, you're not really going to be inclined to create when you're in survival mode. So I was wondering, Karl, what your thoughts are on that, if there's been any studies with artist groups, for example, or other self-employed creatives where it's been of a benefit?
I don't know if studies targeting that. It's something that's a little harder to test than some of the other outcomes that we look at. But we know that we're really underutilizing talent. Almost every professional ballerina comes from a very privileged background, because unless your parents can support you to do all those ballet studies and then just basically work for nothing for the first few years of their career, as my brother's child is doing, it's really just about impossible, not quite impossible. And that means we're wasting like 90% of the potential ballet talent we have out there. And it's really not that different with any other art form. Most things are done by people who have the time to do them. We take people and we put them in the position. If you're a little bit privileged, it's going to happen to you in your early 20s. If you're less privileged, it's going to happen to you when you're 18. You've got to get out there and make a living, and that makes it really impossible for you to plan your life and build a good life, build a career, do something that matters to you. We're taking away that opportunity so that people can go and clean somebody else's toilet. And so many of the things that we make people do in the name of everyone must work are really frivolous services provided for very privileged people.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. If you look at the wealth distribution in the UK from kind of the 1960s and 70s, when there was an optimism, up until the present day, the wealth distribution has become so bad and so asymmetric that now it's only middle and upper class people going into the arts or going into acting, for example. It's so bad. You used to have David Jason, for example, working class actor. There used to be more genuine diversity there, and there's literally nothing now. It's all people from the same class as Benedict Cumberbatch who were doing this. And there's a real smoke screening of the problem, because when you start talking about anything like wealth inequality and UBI, people go, oh, so you think he shouldn't be an actor? Why did I even say that? It's got nothing to do with the person. It's to do with the system. It's like, be tough on systems, kind on people. What people are trying to do in terms of doing terrible jobs. There is a guy called Rutger Bregman, and he started the School for Moral Ambition. So people who are in these kind of jobs where they're going, oh, we don't actually want to do this anymore and work for a conglomerate that's soul sucking and tax avoiding, they can then go to the School of Moral Ambition and actually find a way to start solving the world's problems while doing something worthwhile. But there's still a class issue there where you need to be in that certain middle income position to go, oh, actually, I want to switch careers. And that privilege still isn't there. And I think UBI would really help with that.
There are a number of studies that are ongoing. We don't have any results out of them yet, but actually just this morning, I was working on thinking through what are the key research questions in the artist community, right, around guaranteed income or UBI. And one of the things that came up as we were brainstorming was about the fact that artists are so frequently expected to perform work for free. Very similar to care work, but it's community care work. Please do this installation for the library. Or, no, we don't quite have the budget because we're a nonprofit or a government organization. So one of the ways I think that guaranteed income or UBI might work in this community is, again, around the sort of agency and the seeing people as people and not necessarily tying that work to the monetary gain, but also not letting communities get away with the exploitation of artists because it is a profession that so many don't take seriously and don't see. In art-rich communities, we know that there's 14% lower violent crime. We know that test scores are about 15% higher for students, right? So there are community level effects that can be tied to the richness of art that I think are important to uphold.
That's just the thing about living in an enriched environment, and you can see that through wealth disparity. It's how interesting that ultra rich people have so much art everywhere, but if you go to a council estate, it's all bare walls. Also, in terms of the art industry as well, because it's so deeply deregulated now and there is no guaranteed income, a lot of the artists, even famous ones, are now going on OnlyFans. So Kate Nash, she's someone who's been really quite famous. She wasn't able to buy her children Christmas presents, so she went on OnlyFans. And a universal basic income or a guaranteed income would prevent the financial coercion that goes in to a woman ending up on OnlyFans or in any other type of commercial sexual exploitation. What's happened, especially in the UK, with austerity measures, it paved the way for a sexual exploitation explosion. So austerity measures cut the social safety nets. They cut nursing loans, student grants, maintenance grants or loans, cut to the bone every single thing you need to keep a society running and free from corruption. And there was an influx of young, vulnerable women going in to OnlyFans or cam work or prostitution or stripping because they couldn't pay their university bills, they couldn't pay for the residences, to the point that now universities across the UK have sex work distribution leaflets where they go, oh, this is how you can get in. It's a totally fantastic way to supplement your income. And if they have a chronic illness as well and they're less able to work, goldsmiths have said this in their class. Sex work is a fantastic way for a disabled woman to earn money because she can keep her own hours. Women with PTSD, chronic fatigue syndrome, women who may have mobility issues, then being financially coerced into sex work because there's not a universal safety net. To me, it's unconscionable that as a society, we have cut services to the bone, that women are now doing this and it's seen as normalized. I actually wanted to go a little bit on to the sadistic impulse to exploit and abuse women. When a society declines, people become generally either more sadistic or greedy or hedonistic. And the thing is, we are survival-based animals. We rely on reciprocal altruism in order to build complex societies and survive. And then you have the apex predators at the top who are then siphoning off things for them and blaming it on the vulnerable guy. There's a guy called Chris Hedges who did a fantastic lecture. He's a humanitarian on American sadism, and he was documenting how when civilization declines, barbarism intensifies, and that a lack of monetary resources leads to mental distress, leads to sadism, leads to hedonism. So I want to know specifically about UBI's effect on individuals attempting to escape a violent intimate partner, if we have any qualitative studies, and the frequency and the severity of abuse due to stress on the abuser. Because I feel like when guys don't have enough cash, if they already have a propensity for aggression, they want to beat on someone generally who basically he feels like is lesser to him. And that happens in intimate partner violence. And I'm also wondering as well if UBI could work in tandem with domestic violence services in future to create things like a secret haven account. So, for example, if someone is subject to coercive or financial control, you can have a secret bank account set up with a haven charity where the UBI guaranteed income would go into a separate account that the abuser doesn't know about while you make your exit strategy. So I was wondering, Stacia specifically, and also Karl, you can chime in afterwards, what your thoughts are on that cluster of questions.
There's only one study that I'm aware of that specifically looked at intimate partner violence in the US context. That was ours out of Los Angeles. There is one program operating in the US that is providing guaranteed income to women that have exited. That is as far as I know. It's still really only 5 years into this explosion or third wave, as Karl would call it. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I think continued targeting toward populations and also, as you mentioned, the austerity measures that most recently swept through with the big ugly bill in the US, we're going to have most likely an influx in vulnerable women that are taking part in exploitative work and therefore may benefit from a guaranteed income. The theory would tell us that UBI could either ameliorate or exacerbate the threat or severity of intimate partner violence. On the one hand, it may offer an opportunity for exit. On the other, it may cause friction in power dynamics in the relationship to result in violence or exacerbation of violence. A personal story I'll tell you, one of the first experiments that we ran, I did the onboarding myself with some community partners, and I sat down with a young woman that was currently pregnant, and she had just found out that she was going to receive the guaranteed income over a course of years. And normal questions that we kind of ask with onboarding: how's this going to interact with your existing benefits? Let's make sure that you're well informed. Are there any resources or anything that you would need to plan for the future? And she says, I can't wait to get an apartment for the new baby. And I was like, oh, that is so incredible. And she looks at me and she said, and I'm going to leave my boyfriend.
Wow.
And I was like, hell yeah, sister. Yeah, you are. Right. So that was like my first onboarding experience coming from, doing homelessness work and IPV work and then into the guaranteed income space. And that was incredibly powerful for me. But we scaled up from that one woman to now 20,000 people across the country that are part of one of our studies. I know that both things are happening. I know in some cases it might exacerbate. I know in other cases it might ameliorate. I'm saying that anecdotally. Sort of statistically, it's leaning toward mitigating women's risk. And what happened after we released that finding out of Los Angeles last August was the city of Los Angeles, in a multi-billion-dollar deficit, still appropriated around $3 million out of their city budget to be able to support ongoing guaranteed income programs to women that were leaving violent relationships or were interested to leave violent relationships. And that's paired with some city services as well. So I think it'll be even more effective in helping women have their own agency to leave.
It's also one of those things where people don't really demand any evidence to say, oh, people are going to be lazier. But then when you say women will be able to get out of abusive relationships, then they want loads of evidence. Why do you think so many abusers pick on vulnerable people? Because that's where they're most likely to get away with it. The less vulnerable you are, the less likely this stuff is going to happen. And UBI eliminates the worst kinds of financial vulnerability, not all kinds of financial vulnerability, but the one where you're afraid you won't have a roof over your head, won't have food. It eliminates those. That is certainly going to reduce violence and exploitation. It's not going to eliminate it, but it will certainly reduce it. There's no reasonable argument that it is going to have less than a very significant relief. We had all this Me Too things with people like Weinstein. Weinstein was picking on very privileged women because he had leverage over them, because he was this major mogul in Hollywood. And those were famous, those were exposed. Epstein was picking on very poor women. Mostly he was picking on poor women. He was exposed for other reasons. But this kind of stuff happens on a smaller scale every day at a McDonald's, at a Denny's restaurant, at the car wash. That's where you've got employees who are not just doing this because, oh, I want to be an actress, which is a worthy thing. You work all your life for that. I'm not going to put those women down either. But these are women that are doing this for a roof over their heads. And you don't hear about that. There were not loads of McDonald's employees talking about the sexual harassment they had during the Me Too movement. UBI gives those women power, and that's undeniable.
I was going to comment before I ask another question. People have many different perspectives on what the sex industry is, whether it's better to cast it as labor or as exploitation. We come down on the exploitation side. When it relates to UBI, I mean, I'm very encouraged to hear that there are programs springing up, at least experimental ones, for women leaving violent partners. I think we have a much better chance to convince research grants committees or governments to invest in exit from the sex industry if we understand it as a form of violence and exploitation rather than a job akin to, I don't know, taxi driving, which is risky actually, but we do consider it a normal job. My next question was going to be to Stacia. This is also related to the practical implementation of UBI, that it can vary between countries, how practical it is to do it, because I come from Germany, so I'm always thinking about Germany, but the reality is here in our sexual exploitation industry, most women are not German, they're Romanian, Bulgarian, Hungarian. So if Germany were to pass a UBI, which I think we would all be celebrating for months if that happened, my understanding is a Romanian citizen could not access it. So then if we wanted to fight the Romanian poverty, we'd have to get organized in Romania. But my understanding is it's harder for poorer states to implement UBIs. Did I understand that correctly? And if so, what are the reasons?
Sure. So I think it's really just the specialization and infrastructure that you need to deliver cash. So one of the first studies that I did was actually with Dolly Parton, our Lord and Savior.
Awesome. That is so cool. Sorry.
She's a big hero in the UBI movement.
She is. And it was unknown, right? And so what happened is there was a wildfire that took place in Tennessee, which is an area where I'm from. And the wildfire decimated about 1,000 homes and unfortunately took the lives of 11 people. And so Dolly Parton comes through and does this telethon and says, I'm going to give $1,000 a month for 6 months to every individual that lost their homes. Okay, great. What happened is a queue formed outside of this local convention center and checks were passed out. And that is all wonderful, exciting on a small scale, but absolutely impossible when we think about the enormity of countries like Germany and especially the US, right? You have to have an infrastructure in place. So when it comes to delivering a UBI in the US, we have many of the mechanisms already there because so many of us already received an economic stimulus payment, even under the Bush administration, and certainly during COVID-19. But you point out something that's really important, which is many folks that are here with mixed documentation or without documentation, we're not able to receive those through a direct deposit like many of us did. And instead, what happened is they were sent to local social service agencies, right? And then dispersed in the community that way, very similar to the way that Dolly Parton did it. So this is to say it is difficult, but not impossible because immigrants are strong groups and typically very close-knit groups of individuals that can find ways to allocate resources. Is that the way that it should be done? I absolutely don't think so. I don't think that we should rely on existing community resources in the absence of investment and infrastructure to allow everyone to receive a UBI, but is likely what might happen in places without that sort of infrastructure where it simply goes through the Treasury Department. Karl, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
This is a bigger problem in the EU because you have free movement of labor throughout the EU, but no fiscal policy at the EU level. So you can only introduce something like this at the state level. In most countries in the world, people who are there working are also eligible for whatever benefit systems are available. But that can be a problem with UBI. You could use a UBI if you just said only citizens get it and nobody gets citizenship until they worked here for 15 years. And then we just have a new exploited class and it's the guest workers or the workers on a path to citizenship. That's kind of like what's going on in Qatar, where I am a professor at Georgetown's campus in Qatar. And Qatar doesn't have a basic income, but it has enough policies to make sure there are no poor citizens. But they import poverty from all around the world and they exploit it heavily. That is certainly a danger for any generous policy. So the movement's got to stay universal on this, that We're not going to fall for some sort of a nationalistic look at this. Isn't this great that none of the Americans here are poor and we have all these poor guest workers coming in? Oh, and they're so poor in their home countries. They're really lucky to be here. We start telling ourselves these myths. They come here for a year and they're horribly exploited, and then they go home and we tell ourselves how great we are. When people talk about, what are the dangers in UBI, very few people hit on that. I have been asked that question before. Will it lead to exploiting foreigners? And I say, not if it's well structured, but yes, it could lead to exploitation of foreigners. And we've got to make sure any UBI we introduce is not going to leave out people, especially people in the most exploitive industries like sex work.
But just so I understand correctly, so the goal would be, we do want to go beyond citizens. So if I'm not a citizen in the US or Germany, what do I then have to show at the UBI office, let's say there is one, to qualify? Because there has to be some standard, right? I can't be a tourist. So what would we agitate for?
Well, I know there's different rules in the EU for whether you're an immigrant coming from outside the EU or you're just somebody from Romania. You can just move to Ireland and get a job the next day. But say you're in Germany, you're from Romania or something, you got a job that if you lose your job, are you eligible for the same German unemployment as everybody else?
I think you have to be paying into it for a certain amount of time before you qualify. And that's my understanding.
Yeah, there's a hard trade-off because especially in the EU where you have free movement of labor but no national policy, the best thing to do would be for the EU to introduce it EU-wide. That solves this problem. But if Germany's going to do it, then they've got to strike a balance, okay? You can't just do it instantly so that somebody that lives in the Netherlands 3 blocks from the border is just going to move 4 blocks and suddenly get a basic income, which they could legally do in the EU. You can't make it that easy. There's got to be some kind of waiting period. But the longer the waiting period is, the more likely it is that you're going to exploit people that are coming there for that. I wish I had all the answers. I do not know what is the right waiting period. That's one of the toughest questions.
That kind of brings me on to another question, really, that UBI, again, not being a magic bullet, and there's kind of other pitfalls there, especially with theory versus practice. What are the confines there in terms of how much kind of UBI can realistically change for people, especially if they're being kind of exploited? Because there's got to be other systems in place in order for them to get out of that exploitation, if you see what I'm saying.
We've said repeatedly, we want a UBI, but not to replace other social programs. Which are these social programs that we have that we need to maintain, or ones that we're missing that would be a good package, an anti-poverty package with UBI to expand on the effects?
It's got to be high enough to live on. But what is high enough to live on depends a lot on what other policies are in place. Now, Europe is way ahead of the United States in this because you have better universal public education. You have much cheaper and in some cases free universities. Most countries are going to have something close to universal health care, very often free at the point of delivery. I think we need all of those things just for starters. Now, but the toughest one, I think, is enough to live on everywhere in the country, because the land values differ so much everywhere in the country. If you have the same UBI throughout the country and you don't have any policy about housing, then you got a choice. It can be large enough so that you can live in Manhattan, and then it's going to be super generous to most of the country, perhaps unsustainable. Or you can make it so, well, you could live on this in like the poorest 50% of the counties in the United States. And you did that, it's going to be really low because the cost of housing in most U.S. land areas is really low. But then it's going to be really low. And the people in most of the cities are still going to be deep in poverty. So you've got to have something that addresses the housing policy. Now, that could be a local land-based tax that's distributed locally. That is one way to do it, but there's also, we could change our zoning laws. Part of the reason housing is so expensive is because of zoning laws. Another reason is we could tax the rich. Another reason housing is so expensive because a lot of rich people have 10 houses and aren't using all of them. When you zone it so you only have so much housing in this region, and then you have such inequality where every rich person in the country is going to buy a house there, well, yeah, you're going to push out everybody else. You change rules like that. Let people build more housing and make it so we don't have the inequality to drive up the prices. That can go a long way to do it. If that doesn't finish it, we can do some of the solutions that were tried in the United States and the UK and other countries earlier in the 20th century to have the government actually build housing. The United States did that after World War I. They really stopped doing that at some point in the late 20th century. I'm not an expert on housing, but the cheaper you make housing, the lower the cash level of UBI needs to be in order to make sure everybody has the minimum. I'm for a UBI that's not just the bare minimum, but you solve the housing issue and everything about UBI gets a lot easier.
I agree with you, Karl. I don't think that you can introduce an UBI and remove all other social programs. There are some that I would advocate for radically altering. One of those being TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, which is sort of our very hard to get, very meager welfare program for folks that are actively seeking employment, sometimes employed, typically have children. It's basically a part-time job in order to receive that. And so I think that that could be much more efficient and effective in humanizing to replace with a UBI. I also find it ridiculous in the United States that if you receive food assistance through the government, you are regulated down to whether or not the food that you can buy is hot or cold. We could make some changes there around implementation of a UBI for a potential replacement. Things that I would not replace have to be paired with it: medical care, housing subsidies, educational access, as Karl alluded to. And I'm also a big fan of regional price parity. So benchmarking the amount of a UBI based on a local market. One of them that I often use as an example is the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment using fair market rent value. It's indexed by metropolitan statistical areas and is variable all over the country, but it does introduce the problem that we just spoke about, which is people moving around all about, which we want people to have their freedom to do, but do you disincentivize living in certain places by tagging it sort of to the housing market is an open question.
And another limit that we should talk about, since of the theme of this podcast, its effect on sexual exploitation and women working in the sex industry. And as we said, the worst stuff in sex exploitation is going to be targeting the most vulnerable. Of course, it's going to help on that. But there is a limit. We already alluded to that before. The women who were abused and exploited by Weinstein, a basic income wouldn't have affected very many of those women. But there's a lot of in between. Things like stripping, that stuff. Well, you might think, okay, these aren't usually women, they're just unemployed. This is money that they're getting paid more to do this than they would be to be, say, a waitress or something like that. You might think it would have zero effect. However, once you got a UBI in place, and waiting tables or working at a fast food restaurant or being a janitor, a daycare worker, once these jobs aren't so horrible because people are quitting those until they get better wages and working conditions, wages go there for up. One of the reasons women go into the sex industry is because so many of the jobs that they can get are so stressful and low paid. As you push up from the bottom, it has effects on things that are another level up. Now, that effect is going to dissipate as you go up. And where it's going to end, I don't know, but it's going to have a positive effect. Then you're going to need other policies to address, well, what's the exploitation that isn't just picking on the most vulnerable? Makes that easier.
I completely agree. In terms of that as well, one of the things we need to kind of think about is keeping the women in poverty is intentional, and poverty itself societally is intentional. Because when you can get vulture capitalism, predatory capitalism, where it keeps people poor, and being poor is expensive, if that happens, that's a requirement for exploitation of all kinds. So we've already addressed the false narrative that poverty is brought on by being lazy or being irresponsible. It's all about a meritocracy, which is clearly a bit of a lie. But populations are easier to control when they're afraid. So one of the things I'm really excited to ask both of you is, what's the potential political power shift that can result from an effective UBI? And do you have any political enemies of UBI?
Who comes after you? Who are your biggest haters?
Poverty is intentionally created, and it is created by the same people who created that narrative that somebody who doesn't take a minimum wage job should be judged as lazy. The same people that say, oh, we have a study that shows people work less, that's a bad outcome. That's not a bad outcome. That's people taking power in their lives. We need a lot of low-income people to work a lot less in order to push up wages and improve working conditions at the low end of the sector and push that up. Most of the gains of the last 50 years of economic growth, where our economy has more than doubled, almost all of those gains go to the top 1%. The more poverty there is, the more that's going to happen. And as I say, these benefits dissipate as you go up from the bottom, but it goes pretty far up. If you're somebody that's at the 90th percentile, meaning you've got a higher income than 90% of Americans, you have not gained nearly as much over a person who's at the 90th percentile 50 years ago as that person did versus a person who's that percentile 50 years before that, 100 years ago in 1924. Back then, you'd have had enormous gains between 1925 and 1975. The upper middle class is not doing that much better. Giving more power to all the people who have to work for a living because we're put in this position will help us all as a group. And we need to see that. And the conventional narrative is to try to separate people who are making any kind of money, say, oh, it's going to be taxing you, to helping these lazy people. That narrative is a big enemy. But also, I got to say, a lot of people on the left are still clinging to this idea. There's a very old and very real thing on the progressive side that they worry about. Two kinds of exploitation. That you, the worker, are being exploited by capital, but you're also being exploited by the beggars. You're being exploited by people who could work and don't and aren't part of the working class. This is often racialized, blaming black, brown, whatever people they want to target, and worrying about people at the bottom exploiting the people in the middle. That's a problem that the progressive side has to fight against. And realize once you buy into that narrative that we're worried about poor people exploiting the middle class, and our solution is to make poor people work, well, then you're also making the middle class work. And you're taking away the market power of everyone who works for a living, of the whole 99%. You're sacrificing the power of the entire 99% just because you think there might be a couple people at the bottom that might be exploiting the situation. Don't worry about exploitation from the bottom. Worry about exploitation from the top.
Yeah, amen.
I think one of the things that I was really interested in whenever I started working alongside communities for all of these experiments was around consciousness raising from the feminist tradition, as well as people starting to interrogate their relationship to paid labor. And I think both of those things are starting to bear out, right? So at least one of our sites, we find that people that are receiving these unconditional cash transfers are more likely to be politically involved. So attending a rally or a protest, voting, attending their kids' PTO meeting. The reason why we see that happening is because it awakens something within people to connect with others by simply relinquishing time in order to do that. As Karl was talking about, we need workers to become more picky. We need workers to start talking to each other, and we need workers to refuse to accept the conditions that they're in. UBI puts down the pathway for that to happen by freeing up people's time to imagine a different future and also act on it through building relationship with people. I know I have 1,000 examples, so forgive me another one. There was a young guy who's in high school. He's in one of our studies, receiving $50 a week for a guaranteed income. He works at Burger King. They tried to get him to work on Thanksgiving or Christmas or some holiday, religious holiday. He said, I sat back and thought about it, and I was like, hell no, man. I'm not working for $8. And I know I'm 16. I'm supposed to say yes. But I'm not missing my family gathering to earn $8 at Burger King, right? It's just not happening. So that's the sort of worker power that I think is terrifying to a lot of people. And so if we look at one of the larger studies in the US that found this reduction in work most recently, the funder of that study comes out mere hours after the findings were released and is like, I don't think UBI is the thing anymore. Right? So it's very clear who the enemies are or who the detractors are the people that are really invested in exploiting labor of low-income people.
And that also shows any amount of money that you get in the hands of less privileged people gives them a little power. $50 a week is not enough for this guy to quit his job, but it is enough for him to say, well, okay, if I get fired from Burger King, I can go get a job somewhere else without worrying it too much. And there's narratives just like that in Alaska that's had this very small basic income like thing since the early 1980s, over 40 years. And you get employers complaining, oh, people quit their jobs at the resort and go hunting when they get their permanent fund dividend check. They'll just buy fishing equipment and go fishing until that runs out. They're living off the land instead of working for you. This is a bad thing. There's nothing bad about that. People don't owe you their labor. Really, you owe them as fishing opportunities. This, I think, is the most important thing that comes out of all these studies. Getting all these people from all these different walks of life all over the country, all over the world, really telling their stories. That is so important. That's, well, one of the many things that you're doing that I really appreciate.
While researching for this episode, I came across the fact that there's a lot of UBI experiments happening in my country, Germany, which I definitely need to look into. And my understanding is there's at least one larger one where people can pay into a fund and then they can win a 1-year UBI. And I was going to ask both of you if any of our listeners are like, not only do I want to read more about UBI, maybe I might want to pay into a fund. And then they, when you win the fund, you become a participant in the study. What are some current interesting experiments like that happening where people can check out the website, can go have a look? Is there some that we can point them to right now?
I think one of the most fascinating and underreported UBI studies is, I mentioned Karl and I are headed to Brazil soon. In Marica, Brazil, there is an entire community that receives a universal basic income. Most people know nothing about it, so I would recommend that folks look that project up. That's kind of top of my list and one that I'm personally really excited to see the results from.
Please send us a link and we'll share it.
One of the things I wanted to talk about as well is the kind of the urgency argument for UBI, because where wealth disparity is too great, we struggle to implement it. So I feel like we kind of need to try and push to install UBI in countries where wealth transfer is rising before it's too late. Otherwise, we won't have the resources in which to implement the UBI, like, especially after kind of COVID having a mass disabling event and things like that, where there was a wealth transfer. The UK especially, it's gone from a first world country to basically a third world country with some rich pockets in. It's become a bit of a nightmare to live in. So I feel like a real urgency to push that. So especially in countries that are kind of a little lost to this, how can we start the conversation about getting a UBI? How could we start campaigning? How can we start implementing it where there is already leeway for it to be implemented?
Stacia was just talking about Brazil. There's also a big study going on in Kenya, Give Directly. It's giving just a little bit of money to a lot of people. I think there's something like 10,000 people in this study. And it's a really long-term study because in really poor areas in rural Kenya, a little money, like $1 a day, goes a long way. And you can't even give people $2 because then they're richer than the person in the next village that is working for $1 a day. You're better off, to cause less friction, is to do $1 a day in more and more places. What this, I think, shows is there are fewer barriers than you think to doing it in poor countries. Sure, poor countries don't have a lot of money, but a little money makes a much bigger difference. You give $1 a day to somebody in rural Kenya, that's going to make a huge difference. You give $1 a day to a homeless person in Manhattan, that's really not going to make a huge difference. Also, what you have in most of the poorest countries in the world, you also have some of the highest inequality. So if they can get the political power to tax the wealthiest people in their countries, they actually do have a lot of money to support this kind of UBI. There is openings. The barriers are not really economic, they're political.
I agree with you. They're not economic at all. They're completely political. And so we have to think about what motivates those that are motivated by money and power. And that is more money and power. I think in order to be effective, and I'm a researcher by day and an advocate by night, I suppose, but I think that one of the ways to demonstrate this argument is to make the efficiency argument. And this is not a return on investment argument. This is a look at the investments that we make. I'll say, for example, into IPV, how many people are able to realize their own goals. That's what truly matters. How many women that want to escape are able to, and is there efficiency in adding a UBI into that to help her stay in a situation that is safe and comfortable for her own flourishing. And we made this argument in front of city council in Los Angeles and said, you know, this program was $12,000 per year. Is a woman's life worth that to you? And I think most people would say yes.
With that, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share, and where can people check out your work and what you're doing?
Okay, well, you can find out more about what I've done on Widerquist.com. If you could spell my name, you can find my website. All the research that I can legally put on my website, I do. So there's free versions. If you email me at karl@widerquist.com, I can send you the published version. But usually there's an early version that I can publish on my own website without violating copyright. That's widerquist.com. So WIDERQUIST.com. Yeah, it's hard to spell. At least I got my own name as a website.
Yes.
I work with an incredible team of PIs and research scientists and students. You can find us at the Center for Guaranteed Income Research. We're at PENNCGIR.org.
Fabulous. You have both been absolutely stellar guests. It's been an immense pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much, and best of luck with the incredible work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a joy talking.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.